The sky above Ridgerest turned the color of a bad bruise at 2:30 in the afternoon on March 2nd, 1887. Not the soft purple of evening coming in gentle and expected. Something uglier, something that pressed down on the high prairie like a hand that intended to stay. The temperature had read 38 degrees at the Mercantile at noon. Reasonable. Almost hopeful for early March at 8,000 feet. But the horses knew better. They had stopped grazing an hour before the clouds appeared clustering near fence posts, with their ears pinned flat and their nostrils working the northwest wind for information that no human instrument could measure. The magpies knew better too. They had abandoned their colony in the cottonwoods along Ridgecrest Creek that morning without a single call between them. No squabbling, no harsh territorial announcement. Just gone flying south in tight formations that looked nothing like ordinary migration and everything like flight from something that had no intention of stopping. 91 souls lived scattered across that high Colorado prairie, spread among 6 isolated homesteads, connected by wagon tracks already disappearing beneath sideways driven snow. Most of them looked at the darkening sky and thought, weather passed, weather always passed at altitude. You endured it, you complained about it, you survived it, and by April you forgot how bad it had been. One person in Ridgecrest looked at that sky and thought something entirely different. Hazel Vane stood at the entrance to her central chamber with one hand pressed flat against the sandstone wall, feeling the vibration that her grandmother Gretle had taught her to recognize before she could read a word of English. The stone spoke in frequencies below hearing. It spoke of pressure dropping faster than any barometer could track, of moisture building in the atmosphere, in quantities the sky could not long contain, of cold moving down from the Canadian territories, with the patience of something that did not need to hurry because it knew exactly where it was going. She had been waiting for this for 2 years, not this storm specifically, but something like it, something that would make the difference between preparation and regret visible to everyone who had ever laughed at the word preparation when it came from her mouth. She pulled her hand from the wall, looked at the calluses on her palm, thick as saddle leather, earned over 2 years of pickaxe and shovel, and the particular stubbornness that frontier widows cultivated from necessity, and she went to check on Cinder. The strawberry roan mare stood in the small stable attached to Hazel's surface cabin ears, rotating toward the northwest with the focused attention of a creature whose ancestors had survived on the open plains by knowing when something large and dangerous was moving in the dark. Cinder was 19 months old when Hazel bought her in Leadville with money that represented everything she had left in the world. The horse had thrown her twice in that first month, testing the boundaries of this new arrangement with the frank skepticism of an animal that had learned not to extend trust without evidence. The evidence had accumulated slowly over shared miles and difficult winters, and the particular intimacy of a woman who spoke to her horse the way other women spoke to God, without expectation of answer, but with the genuine need to say the words out loud. "You feel it too," Hazel said, running one hand along the mare's neck, where the pale reddish coat had been thickening since November. Cinder pressed her nose against Hazel's shoulder in the gesture of trust that had taken 14 months to earn. "It's coming. Worse than anything they've built for, and they won't listen, so we'll be ready alone." She had already decided to try one more time, not because she expected to be heard, but because her grandmother's memory required it of her, and Hazel Vane did not dishonor the dead by taking the easy path. To understand Hazel Vane in the winter of 1887, you need to go back 3 years to a morning in October of 1884, when the mountain took everything she thought her life was going to be. Callum Vane had worked the silver mines outside Leadville for 3 years by the time the tunnel took him. He was 31 years old, broad through the shoulders, with hands that could gentle a frightened horse or pry loose a reluctant ore seam with equal competence. He descended into the earth every morning before dawn with a tin lamp clipped to his hat and the quiet acceptance of a man who had made his calculations about risk and decided the silver was worth it. The timber framing was the problem. It was always the timber framing in every mine and every mountain in Colorado, because timber was cheap and stone reinforcement was not. And the men who made those decisions lived in offices in Denver and Chicago and New York, where the mountain was a concept rather than a physical fact, pressing down on your shoulders in the dark. On the 14th of October, a section of tunnel wall buckled. The timber bracing, already stressed by groundwater infiltration that nobody had properly addressed, failed in sequence. One beam, then another, then a cascade of collapse that moved through 60 feet of underground passage in approximately 4 seconds. Hazel was at the mine entrance when she heard the sound, a low rolling concussion that she felt in her sternum before she heard it with her ears. She knew immediately what it meant. Every miner's wife in Leadville knew that sound. She waited 7 hours at that entrance. She did not cry. She did not pray in any conventional sense. She stood with her hands clasped in front of her and watched the rescue operation with the focused attention of a woman who needed to know everything and could not afford the luxury of looking away. They found Callum in the fourth hour of digging. He was in a small air pocket that the collapse had accidentally preserved, and he had died without injury in any visible sense. Asphyxiation, the foreman said when the pocket's air was exhausted. But his arms were raised, both of them positioned above his head, as though he had been trying to hold back the collapse with nothing but muscle and will. The foreman said the position was consistent with a man trying to brace against a falling ceiling. Hazel said nothing in response. She looked at her husband's raised arms and understood that Callum Vane had spent his final minutes refusing to accept what was happening to him. She sold everything within a week. The house with its single glass window that they had saved for together for 18 months. The furniture, Callum's tools, his Sunday coat, his father's pocket watch that he'd carried every day since he was 16 but never wound because he didn't want to wear the spring down. All of it converted into cash, which converted into a wagon, and 6 months of supplies in a strawberry roan mare with a difficult temperament that the seller was glad to be rid of. The horse's name, according to the seller, was Rosie. Hazel renamed her Cinder on the first day for the way her coat glowed in certain lights, like something that had been through fire and survived it. She drove west, then north, climbing until the air thinned and the valleys fell away below her. She was looking for something specific, a particular kind of landscape that her grandmother Gretle had described in enough detail that Hazel could recognize it even though she had never seen it. Soft, sedimentary stone in the hillsides. Underground water detectable by vegetation patterns and subtle surface depression. Elevation enough to ensure cold winters, but not so high as to make agriculture impossible. Isolation enough that no one would interfere. She found it above Ridgerest, Colorado, on a rocky hillside that had defeated 2 previous claimants and earned the contempt of the local land office clerk, a thin man named Whitmore, who looked at her across his desk with the particular pity that men reserve for widows they considered delusional. "Can't grow crops in that soil, Mrs. Vane," he said. "Can't graze cattle on those rocks. The man before you near broke his back trying to dig a cellar and gave up after 3 feet. "How much?" Hazel said. Whitmore blinked. $14 for the 160 acres. She counted out the coins on his desk without hesitation and signed the papers before he could manufacture another objection. She was still holding the pen when something in her chest loosened for the first time since October. Not happiness exactly. More like the specific relief of a person who has been walking the wrong direction for a very long time and has finally turned around. Gretel Mueller would have understood that feeling completely. She was the one who had taught Hazel to recognize it. Gretel Mueller was born in the Bernese Oberland of Switzerland in 1800, the fourth daughter of a farmer who raised goats on a slope that the valley people considered too steep for serious agriculture. She grew up learning the language of the mountain, not metaphorically but practically. The way certain wind patterns preceded certain weather. The way underground springs warmed and cooled in response to atmospheric pressure changes. The way animals modified their behavior in the hours before a major storm with a reliability that no almanac could match. She survived 2 avalanches before her 20th birthday, which was not coincidence. It was knowledge applied under pressure. The first caught her in a root cellar where she had taken shelter after reading a combination of signals, the particular quality of the light, the behavior of the cattle, the way the snow on the upper slope had settled after a warm afternoon. She emerged 6 hours later by digging with her bare hands toward the sound of water flowing beneath the debris because water flows downhill, and downhill was out. The second she saw coming. She had been crossing an open slope when something in the angle of the shadows and the sound of the wind through the pines above told her to move. She ran for a natural cave formation in the rock face and threw herself inside 3 seconds before the avalanche swept past the entrance close enough that she felt the displaced air on her face. She immigrated to America in 1838, married a Pennsylvania farmer of Scots descent named Aldrich Mueller, and spent the rest of her life teaching her daughter and granddaughter to read the earth the way other women read scripture. Carefully, repeatedly, with the understanding that the text contained information that could save your life if you paid sufficient attention. Gretel died in 1881, whispering her final lesson to 17-year-old Hazel, who sat beside her bed with both hands wrapped around her grandmother's. "The earth protects those who go into it," Gretel said. Her English had never lost the Swiss cadence that made certain words sound like they were being sung rather than spoken. "The sky betrays. The stone remains." Remember that, little one. La. When everything else is gone, the stone remains. Hazel had been repeating those words to herself for 6 years by the time she signed the papers for her 160 acres of worthless Colorado hillside. She repeated them as she drove her wagon up the rocky track to survey what she had purchased. She repeated them as she pressed her palm to the exposed face of the sandstone outcropping near what would become her front entrance, and felt the particular softness that Gretel had described, soft enough to carve hard enough to stand the ideal material for the project that Hazel had been planning since the day she watched them carry Callum out of the mountain. Callum had died because cheap timber was placed where stone should have been. She had decided somewhere in those 7 hours at the mine entrance that she would never make the same mistake. She would build with stone. She would build into stone. She would make a place that the mountain could not take from her because she would be inside the mountain herself. She began digging in the spring of 1885. The sandstone yielded to her pickaxe the way Gretel had promised, steadily, predictably, with the cooperative quality of a material that has been shaped by water over centuries and has no particular investment in resisting a woman with patience and proper tools. Hazel worked 4 hours each morning before the heat of the day and 4 hours in the evening when the air cooled again. She followed the natural fracture lines the way Gretel had taught her, letting the stone show her where it wanted to open, rather than forcing it in directions it resisted. By the end of the first summer, she had the central chamber roughed out, 20 feet by 15 with a ceiling high enough to stand upright without stooping. She installed a cast iron stove whose chimney she ran up through 15 feet of rock to emerge invisibly among a natural boulder formation on the hilltop above. From the surface, there was no visible smoke, no visible structure. From below, there was warmth that the worst of Colorado's winters could not reach. She spent the winter of 1885 finishing the central chamber and beginning the passages. Her grandmother's lessons had been specific about passages, not just the excavation technique, but the purpose. The earth protects those who go into it. Not just one person, the plural had always been deliberate. By the spring of 1886, she had excavated 4 branching passages, each running outward from the central hub toward the neighboring homesteads. The longest ran 87 feet to the northwest toward the Prescott Cade property. She had never spoken to Prescott Cade at that point beyond brief transactional exchanges at the Mercantile. She did not know him well enough to predict whether he would be grateful or hostile when he eventually discovered what lay beneath his property. She carved each passage door to open from both sides. This was the detail that mattered most and that no one in Ridgerest would understand until March of 1887. She had not built escape routes. She had not built private tunnels. She had built connections, deliberate, engineered, maintained connections between her central hub and the people above her who did not know they were connected. She consulted a Denver lawyer by letter before beginning this portion of the work. $2 for his written opinion that mineral rights beneath unsurveyed public land remained in the territorial domain, and that a homesteader excavating beneath the surface of adjacent properties without disturbing those properties or their structures was engaged in entirely legal activity. She filed the letter carefully in a tin box that she kept in the provisions chamber. She suspected she might need it someday. The provisions chamber held what Gretel had always called the argument against catastrophe. 200 pounds of dried beans and mouse-proof ceramic crocks, 80 jars of preserved vegetables, carrots, beets, wild onions, the tough prairie greens that most Ridgerest residents overlooked as weeds, but which Hazel recognized as nutrition. Smoked elk meat sufficient to feed 30 people for a month. Water from an underground spring fed into barrels supplemented by the spring's direct flow through a channel she had carved along the chamber's north wall. The spring was the most important element not just for drinking water, but for information. The temperature of underground water was, as Gretel had taught her, the most reliable barometer available at altitude. When the water warmed, pressure was dropping. When pressure dropped fast, weather was building. She spent $43 on lamp oil, $127 on iron hinges, ventilation pipes, and the tools she wore through in the excavation. She spent nothing on lumber. 340 feet of tunnel in total by the time the work was complete in the autumn of 1886. 6 chambers, 4 branch passages. Ventilation pipes set at 45 degrees angles 14 inches in diameter, positioned to draw fresh air down and push a stale air up regardless of wind direction on the surface. The completed refuge resembled nothing so much as a thought that had been given physical form, the thought that survival was not a matter of luck or strength, but of preparation undertaken before the emergency arrived. From the surface, it was nearly invisible. 6 modest wooden doors set into hillsides, each indistinguishable from the dozens of storage hatches and root cellar entrances that dotted the Ridgerest Valley. 4 of those doors opened into passages that connected to the properties of people who did not know Hazel Vane had built them anything. This was the secret she carried through the autumn of 1886 when the mockery began in earnest. Prescott Cade was not a complicated man, which made him dangerous in the way that simple forces are dangerous not because they are subtle, but because they are consistent. He owned 4,000 acres of prime grazing land that stretched from Ridgecrest Creek to the Eastern Ridge, built through 15 years of calculated purchase and strategic marriage, and the specific kind of determination that mistakes confidence for wisdom. He had arrived in Colorado from Ohio in 1869 with $300 and a talent for reading land values that had served him well in conditions of ordinary difficulty. Extraordinary difficulty was not something Prescott Cade had ever been required to prepare for. He had survived enough normal winters to believe that normal winters were all there were. He was purchasing ammunition at the Mercantile in October of 1886 when Hazel entered. She was measuring out lamp oil by the gallon, counting her coins with the precision of a woman who knew exactly what she could spare and had no interest in pretending otherwise. Her dress carried sandstone dust in the creases. Her hands were the hands of someone who worked with them constantly and had stopped caring what that looked like. Cade watched her. Something about the combination, the solitary woman, the deliberate self-sufficiency, the evidence of labor that none of his neighbors' wives performed, activated something in him that he would not have been able to articulate if asked. He had learned 15 years earlier not to trust people who operated outside understood systems. That lesson had cost him his younger brother, who had died following the instructions of a traveling medicine man in Ohio in 1878. The medicine man had seemed competent and confident and had operated completely outside any system Cade knew how to evaluate. His brother had been buried before the spring thaw. He had never told anyone this story. He would not tell it for another year. What came out instead was contempt offered in the direction of the assembled mercantile audience, with the practiced ease of a man accustomed to being listened to. That woman, he announced, his voice pitched to carry Biso, burrows like a creature that has forgotten it has a soul. The laughter came immediately. It always did for Prescott Cade because 15 years of quiet dominance had trained the community to find his observations amusing, regardless of their content. "What do you build down there? Mrs. Vane a den for your litter." Hazel did not look up from her counting. 17 cents for a gallon of oil. She had brought exactly that amount. "I have seen her," Cade continued, warming to his audience, emerging from holes in the hillside covered in dirt like something that has never known the sun. "I thought the claim worthless when I heard she'd bought it. I was wrong. It has become worse than worthless. It has become the mole hole." The name caught like dry grass in August. By Sunday, it had traveled to every homestead in the valley. By the following week, Dorothea Cade's Ladies' Aid Society had voted unanimously with one abstention from Clara Breckenridge, who was considered soft on such matters, to exclude Hazel Vane from the annual Christmas supper. "Her fixation is unwholesome," Dorothea Cade told the assembled women in her parlor, her voice carrying the particular authority of a woman who had never wanted for anything, and had therefore developed strong opinions about the proper management of those who had. "Living like an animal beneath the earth. What kind of example does such behavior set? We must think of the children." Reverend Corbett Weil suggested privately to Prescott Cade that perhaps the widow Vane might benefit from fellowship rather than exclusion. Cade laughed until he had to wipe his eyes. "Fellowship will not cure a woman who thinks she is a prairie dog, Reverend. Some creatures simply are not meant for civilized company." Weil said nothing more. He had a congregation to consider and a comfortable life inside the social structure that Prescott Cade effectively controlled. The distance between his private sympathy and his public silence was the distance between conviction and comfort, and he had not yet been required to measure it precisely. Hazel heard all of it. Ridgerest was too small for secrets, and her secrets were the underground kind that no one was looking for. What traveled through the social air with perfect efficiency was the mockery, the mole hole, the mole woman. The whispered suggestion, circulated first by Dorothea Cade and then amplified by women who should have known better, that perhaps grief had done something to Hazel Vane's mind, that the mind collapse had taken not just her husband, but her capacity for rational thought. She said nothing in response. She continued her work. She reinforced the ventilation, tested the spring's flow rate, calculated provisions against the number of mouths that might eventually need feeding. In the evenings, she sat with Cinder in the stable, brushing the mare's coat by lamplight until it glowed. "Let them talk," she told the horse. "The stone holds what matters." On the 28th of February, 1887, the magpies left the cottonwoods 2 weeks ahead of any migration she had recorded in 5 years of observation. They went south in silence, without the territorial squabbling that normally accompanied any collective movement. By mid-morning, not a single bird remained in the entire colony. Cinder refused grain that day for the first time since her first winter at altitude. She stood in the paddock with her head elevated and her ears working in patterns that Hazel recognized as active listening rather than routine environmental scanning. The other horses in Ridgerest, she observed during a deliberate mid-morning ride along the valley road, were behaving identically, clustering near structures, unwilling to move into open pasture, doing in their animal way exactly what Gretel Muller had taught her that intelligent creatures did when something large was approaching. The spring ran warmer than it had since October. She measured it carefully with her hand and then with a thermometer, confirming what her palm already knew. Underground water responds to atmospheric pressure with a sensitivity that no surface instrument can match. The warmth meant the pressure above was falling sharply enough that the contrast made 44-degree groundwater feel almost tepid against her fingers. She went to the feed store that afternoon to purchase additional grain for Cinder and hay for the extra horses she intended to bring underground when the time came. Prescott Cade was holding court near the stove, his voice filling the building with the comfortable authority of a man who had never been wrong about anything in front of people who would remember. "Unseasonable warm spell coming," he announced. "The almanac predicts mild temperatures through March, early planting season. I would lay money on it." Hazel set her grain order on the counter and turned to face the room. She had rehearsed this moment without realizing she was doing it. Every lesson Gretel had given her about the obligation of knowledge included this corollary knowledge that is not shared when sharing might prevent harm, is a kind of hoarding that the mountain does not forgive. "The magpies have gone south early," she said. Her voice was level. She had learned in the 15 months since arriving in Ridgerest to strip all pleading from her tone when speaking to a crowd that had already decided how to receive her. "The horses will not graze. The spring runs warm. A significant storm is building." The silence lasted approximately 1 second before Prescott Cade turned to face her with an expression that combined amusement and contempt in proportions she had grown familiar with over the past year. "The spring runs warm," he repeated, pitching his voice for the room. "The mole woman thinks birds know more than the farmer's almanac." He spread his hands in a gesture of theatrical wonder. "Tell me, Mrs. Vane, do your tunnels have special windows for reading the future? Perhaps you commune with earthworms down there, and they whisper prophecies." The laughter moved through the room like a wave. Edmund Pruitt, standing near the back, opened his mouth. Hazel saw it, the small physical preparation for speech, the slight forward lean that preceded words. Then Edmund's eyes moved to Prescott. Cade, and whatever he had been about to say, stayed where it was. He looked at the floor. He was not a cruel man. He was a comfortable one, and comfort had its own kind of cowardice. Hazel gathered her grain and left without another word. She had tried. That was what Gretel's memory required. She had tried, and they had chosen not to listen, and what followed would not be her burden to carry. She spent the first 2 days of March in final preparation. The provisions were already in place, had been in place for months, but she checked them again with the methodical attention of someone who understood that the difference between sufficient and insufficient was often the difference between living and dying. Dried beans confirmed. Preserved vegetables confirmed. Smoked meat confirmed. Water barrels full. Spring channel clear. Ventilation pipes tested at each end. She moved Cinder underground on the afternoon of March 2nd, leading the mare down the gently sloping passage to the chamber she had excavated, specifically for her 12 feet below the surface, lined with dry straw, warmer than any surface stable could manage in what was coming. Cinder walked in without hesitation. 2 years of shared difficulty had built in her a capacity for trust that required no explanation. If Hazel said go into the ground, then into the ground was where safety lived. The sky by 4 in the afternoon had become the color of a bruise, deepening toward black at its center. The wind found its voice at the same hour, not a sudden gust, but a low gathering moan that built by degrees into something with texture and weight, and the quality of a sound that intended to continue for some time. The temperature was in free fall, 30 degrees in an hour, heading somewhere the thermometer at the Mercantile had not visited in living memory. Hazel stood at her main entrance for a long moment, looking at the valley below. Smoke from 6 chimneys rising and then immediately horizontal in the northwest wind. Lights in the Cade mansion's upper windows. The forge where Silas Breck would be banking his fire against the cold, trusting the same structure that had served him adequately through a dozen ordinary winters. None of them were prepared for an extraordinary one. She had built doors that opened from both sides. She had built them that way from the beginning, before she had ever spoken to any of these people, before she knew their names well enough to attach them to faces, before she knew which of them would mock her and which would simply watch while others did. She had built both-sided doors because Gretel Muller had taught her that knowledge hoarded is knowledge wasted, and preparation made for one is preparation that doesn't understand its own purpose. The wind picked up another register, moving from moan to something closer to a howl that sounded like nothing human. Hazel stepped back inside and pulled the entrance door shut behind her. The stone walls absorbed the sound, reducing the wind's voice to a vibration she could feel in her feet and her hands in the back of her throat, but not hear with the sharp, panic-inducing clarity of the unprotected surface. She went to check the spring temperature one final time. It had warmed another half degree in the past 2 hours. The pressure was still falling, fast. She sat down in her hearth room in the chair she had made from salvaged wagon wood in the first winter and opened the journal that had been her grandmother's. The handwriting was in German, which Hazel read slowly, tracing familiar passages with one finger as the stove ticked and settled around her, and the storm outside found its full voice and began the work it had come here to do. Outside, Ridgerest learned what it meant to be 8,000 feet above sea level when the sky decided to demonstrate the full range of what it was capable of. The wind drove snow horizontally through the darkness, not falling so much as flying. Temperatures dropped through zero and kept going. The cold found every gap in every wall, every poorly sealed window, every optimistic corner where settlers had trusted lumber to hold against what the Colorado high country could become when it stopped being ordinary. Most winters, such trust proved sufficient. This was not most winters. Beneath it, in 15 feet of solid sandstone, Hazel Vane fed her stove and listened to the vibration of the storm through stone that had been learning to absorb such forces for 1,000,000 years before any human had thought to carve a room inside it. She had a month of food, she had water, she had light and warmth, and the journal of a woman who had survived 2 avalanches by understanding, before the moment of crisis arrived, exactly what the mountain was capable of and what it required of the people who chose to live in its shadow. She had built doors that opened from both sides. Now she waited for someone to knock. The storm did not arrive the way storms are supposed to arrive, with dramatic announcement, with a clear before and after that allows the human mind to mark the transition and prepare itself accordingly. It arrived the way the worst things always arrive, gradually and then all at once. The first night was wind. Wind so constant and so loud that it stopped being a sound and became a condition, like darkness or cold. Something the body simply had to incorporate into its understanding of the current state of the world. It found the gaps in every structure in Ridgerest with the patient thoroughness of an inspector who has all the time in the world and intends to be comprehensive. It found the space between the Mercantile's roof boards and the top of the north wall. It found the seam in Edmund Pruitt's window frame where the wood had swelled and shrunk through 4 seasons until the original fit was a memory. It found the elaborate imported glass of Prescott Cade's mansion windows and pressed against it with a steadiness that was almost contemplative as though it were merely curious about how much pressure glass imported from St. Louis at considerable expense could absorb before it reconsidered its commitments. The snow came with the second day. Not falling, that word implies gravity, implies the peaceful vertical descent of something yielding to natural law. This snow was driven. Horizontal and hard, each crystal sharpened by cold into something closer to ground quartz than the soft accumulation that children ran out to catch on their tongues. It built against the north faces of every structure in the valley with the relentless patience of a force that did not tire, did not pause, did not moderate itself in response to the scale of what it was bearing. 12 feet below the surface of the Ridgerest hillside, Hazel Vane felt none of this directly. She felt the vibration of it through the sandstone, a frequency that ran up through the soles of her feet and into her legs and settled somewhere in her chest as a constant background hum. She had learned in 2 winters underground to read that hum the way a ship's captain reads the feel of the sea through the hull, not with panic but with assessment. What is it doing? How long has it been doing it? What is likely to come next? What it was doing was intensifying, steadily without plateau, without the brief moderations that ordinary storms offered as reassurance that they were temporary. This one had no interest in reassurance. She checked the ventilation pipes at 4-hour intervals, climbing the access ladder to confirm that the angled design was holding against the wind's attempts to force snow into every opening. The 45-degree angle that Gretle had specified in her journal, based on observations of natural cave formations in the Swiss Alps, proved itself exactly as effective as the old woman had predicted. Fresh air moved down, stale air moved up. The storm outside could howl at whatever register it chose. Below, the air remained breathable, and the temperature in the hearthroom held steady at 51 degrees, not comfortable by any standard associated with the heated interior, but warm enough that Cinder had stopped wearing her full winter coat's worth of tension and was eating her grain with the relaxed attention of a horse that had decided the current situation was manageable. Hazel fed the stove. She read Gretel's journal. She measured the spring temperature every 6 hours and recorded it in the small notebook she kept on the shelf above the water channel. The spring continued warm, which meant the pressure was still falling, which meant the storm was still building toward whatever its ceiling was going to be. She had not yet heard anything from above. No knocking, no voices, no indication that any of the 91 people living on the surface had discovered the doors she had built into their hillsides. She told herself this was not her concern. She had built the doors. She had warned them. She had done everything that Gretel's memory required of her. What happened next was between the people of Ridgerest and the choices they had made. She almost believed it. On the morning of the 3rd day, Prescott Cade's cattle barn began to fail. He was watching from the 2nd-floor window of his mansion when the first section of roof tore free. He had built that barn 3 years earlier with lumber shipped at considerable expense from a mill outside Denver, using plans drawn by a man in Ohio who had designed a dozen similar structures in the flatlands east of Columbus. The plans were sound for flatland conditions. They had not been drawn with the specific load characteristics of Colorado high country snow in mind, nor with the wind speeds that the Ridgerest Valley could funnel between its eastern and western ridges when a genuine weather system decided to move through. The roof went in sections. First, the northwest corner, which had been taking the direct force of the wind since the storm began. Then the central beam that the northwest corner had been supporting. Then in a cascade that took approximately 40 seconds, everything else. 200 head of cattle stood exposed to temperatures that had by then reached 31 degrees below zero. Their bodies steamed in the killing cold. Their breath, visible for a moment in the darkness, disappeared almost before it formed. They moved together in the instinctive clustering of animals that understand cold as a mortal threat and warmth as a thing that bodies can generate collectively if there are enough bodies and they are close enough together. There were not enough bodies. The cold was not a thing that could be negotiated with through proximity. By evening, they had stopped moving. By the following morning, 200 dark shapes were arranged in frozen clusters across the snow behind the collapsed ruin of the most expensive privately owned structure in Ridgerest. They had died in the positions where they finally surrendered to the arithmetic of heat loss, grouped by some unconscious social calculation. The older animals on the outside where the wind was worst, the younger ones in the interior where the marginal warmth of shared body heat lasted a few hours longer. Prescott Cade stood at his 2nd-floor window and watched the last of them stop moving. The wind had taken the barn's remains entirely by that point, scattering lumber across a quarter-mile of snow-covered pasture in fragments too small to be useful for anything. The investment, the lumber, the shipping costs, the construction labor, the 3 years of careful breeding that represented itself in the frozen shapes below, was gone with the completeness of a debt that has been called in all at once. He was still standing at the window when his wife Dorothea appeared in the doorway behind him. She was holding their infant daughter against her chest with both arms, the child wrapped in 3 quilts and still shivering with the cold that had been advancing through the mansion's rooms since the windows began to crack. The glass had started going on the second night. Not all at once, the temperature differential between the heated interior and the outside air that had dropped to 20 below was too much for the imported panes to absorb in their expansion and contraction, and they failed one by one with sharp reports that sounded like distant rifle shots. By the morning of the fourth day, every window in the mansion had shattered. The Arctic air moved in through the empty frames with the unhurried confidence of something that had been waiting for exactly this invitation. Dorothea watched her husband stare at the frozen cattle and said nothing. She had been married to Prescott Cade for 18 years, and she knew the geography of his silences well enough to navigate them. This one was different from anything she had encountered before. Not the silence of anger or calculation or the deliberate withholding of a man who was choosing his words carefully. This was the silence of a man who had run out of the internal architecture that normally supported his certainty and was standing in the rubble of it, trying to understand what had happened. She shifted the baby to her left arm and looked past her husband's shoulder at the white nothing beyond the empty window frame. She thought about a woman with calloused hands counting 17 cents onto a mercantile counter. She thought about magpies that had left 2 days before the storm arrived. She thought about an underground spring that ran warm when pressure was falling, and a voice in a feed store that had offered that information freely to people who had laughed in response. She said nothing yet. The time for what she was thinking had not arrived. On the fifth day, the Pruitt house lost its roof. Edmund had been watching it go for 2 days, the progressive groaning of load-bearing timbers under accumulated snow weight that had nothing to do with the structure's original design tolerances. He had reinforced what he could with interior bracing, working by lamplight, while Ida kept the children in the warmest corner and told them stories in a voice calibrated to sound calmer than she felt. When the ceiling finally let go, it gave them 30 seconds of warning, a long, tearing complaint from the central beam that Edmund recognized as final rather than temporary. He got Ida and both daughters out through the side door. He was moving fast and moving well, the focused efficiency of a man who had been preparing himself for this specific moment since he heard the beam start to talk. He got 3 steps back and toward the door. The cold hit him at the threshold with a physicality he had not anticipated. Not when the wind had dropped momentarily as it sometimes did in the middle of a sustained storm catching its breath. Just cold. 40 degrees below zero of pure thermodynamic hostility that moved through his coat and his clothing and into his skin in the time it took him to take 2 steps. He stopped. His wife was out. His daughters were out. The house was collapsing behind him. What was still inside was he had not thought about what was still inside until this exact moment, standing in the doorway with the cold pouring over him like water. Clem's bear. The carved wooden bear that Edmund's father had made for the boy the previous Christmas, working on it in the evenings for 3 weeks while Clem watched with the particular intensity of a 7-year-old who understood that something being made for him specifically was a form of love made tangible. It was on the sleeping shelf where Clem had left it when they ran. Clem was standing in the snow 10 feet from the door, with Ida's hand locked around his wrist. Edmund could see his son's face, the awareness of exactly what was still inside the calculus that a 7-year-old performs with the limited experience he has available. Edmund watched his son's face. He saw the moment the calculation resolved. He tightened his grip on the doorframe and did not move. "Clem," he said. His voice came out strange in the cold, flat strip of resonance. "Stay where you are." He saw something shift in the boy's expression. Not obedience. Something more complicated. The look of a child who has decided that the adult's instruction is wrong and is weighing the cost of acting against it. "Clem!" Louder. The word cost him something in the cold, some warmth he could not spare. Clem looked at his father, then at the door. Then he turned his face toward his mother, and Edmund saw the moment the decision changed, not because of Edmund's command, but because of Ida's face, which was doing something that Edmund had never seen it do in 10 years of marriage, and which communicated to their son in some wordless register that transcended argument. The boy stayed. The roof came down 40 seconds later in a collapse that drove a cloud of ice crystal and splintered wood through the doorway and out into the snow, pushing Edmund back 3 steps. He stood in the white debris cloud and breathed and counted his family. Ida, 2 daughters, Clem, all present. He reached out and picked up his son. He held him for a long moment in the killing cold before reason reasserted itself, and he started moving. They made it to the root cellar, a shallow depression dug into the south-facing hillside that had been adequate for storing vegetables and would now be required to be adequate for storing a family of 4 in temperatures that had no interest in moderation. Edmund banked the small interior brazier with every combustible thing he could reach and settled in to wait. He did not know, lying in that root cellar on the frozen ground, with his children pressed against him for warmth, that the hillside behind the cellar contained a door. A door with iron hinges built to open from both sides, connecting to a passage that ran 300 feet through solid sandstone, to a chamber where a stove was burning, and the temperature was 51 degrees, and there was food enough for 30 people for a month. He did not know this because no one had told him, and he had not thought to look. And this was a failure that he would spend the rest of his life measuring in specific, unforgiving terms. Hazel found the small footprints on the 6th day. She had been conducting her standard passage inspection, working outward from the central hub through each branch in sequence, checking for drift accumulation near the entrance doors, confirming that the frame seals were holding. The branch toward the Pruitt property was the 3rd one she checked, running northeast for approximately 200 feet through a gentle curve that followed a natural seam in the sandstone. The entrance door was open, not ajar, not cracked. Open, fully hinged back against the cut stone frame with snow drifted across the passage floor for the first 30 feet. The cold that had come in through the opening was considerable, dropping the passage temperature from its normal 48 degrees to something her body assessed as below 20. She stood in the doorway looking at the snow and what was visible in it. Small footprints, too small to be an adult's, coming in from outside 3 steps, then stopping, then retreating, then a partial 4th step that ended where the snow on the passage floor ended and bare sandstone began, and as though the small body that had made them had stood at the edge of the cold and the warm and looked into the dark passage and seen nothing and retreated back into the white. She traced the prints outside as far as visibility allowed. 20 feet, 30. They were filling fast in the driven snow, losing definition, becoming suggestions of footprints rather than clear records. At 40 feet, they were indistinguishable from the general surface disturbance. She pulled the door shut and secured it and stood in the passage with her lamp casting its steady yellow circle on the sandstone walls. The cold from the open door was already moderating the stone, absorbing it the way stone absorbed everything slowly without complaint, with the patience of material that measured time in geological units. She stood there for a long time. She did not know for certain what those footprints meant. She told herself this. She was a practical woman who had learned to operate on evidence rather than assumption, and the evidence was ambiguous. A child had opened the door and looked in and left. That was what the evidence showed. The rest was interpretation. She walked back to the central chamber and sat down and did not open Gretle's journal. Silas Breck had raised his 2 draft horses from foals, which meant he had known them for 8 years, which meant they were not property in any sense he found meaningful. They were partners. They were the reason his forge could operate at the scale it did, moving iron stock, hauling finished work, doing the heavy pulling work that his own considerable strength could not manage alone. They were also, he had told his wife the previous spring, the most reliable characters in Ridgerest, which she had taken as an insult and which he had meant as a straightforward assessment. When the stable began to fail on the 6th day, he went in after them. The structure had been built of rough lumber beside the forge, the exterior wall of the forge forming its south face so that some heat bled through in the worst of weather. This had been sufficient for 6 winters. The 7th winter had different ambitions. He heard the first beam crack from inside the forge, where he had been working on a repair job that he intended to complete regardless of the weather outside, because the alternative was sitting in his house, thinking about what he could not control, and Silas Breck had no talent for that. He pulled on his heaviest coat and went through the connecting door into the stable before the second beam had finished its complaint. The horses were against the back wall, pressed together with the whites of their eyes showing in the lantern light. He got halters on both of them by feel and the long practice of a man who had handled these specific animals in every condition available at altitude. He moved toward the front doors. The roof came down behind him. Not all of it, the south section, the part of the roof supported by the forge wall held. But the north section collapsed in a single movement, driving a wave of snow and splintered timber across the floor that hit him in the back of the knees and put him down. He kept the halter ropes. He got back up. He got the horses out the front doors and into the storm. He made it to the forge. He got the doors open. He got the horses inside and the doors shut behind him. He looked down at his feet. He had made the run from stable to forge in his work boots, good leather, well-made, entirely adequate for the temperatures of 6 previous Ridgerest winters. He had been in the storm for approximately 4 minutes. He had been moving continuously, which was the right thing to do in extreme cold, and the distance had been short, and he had done everything correctly. His feet were numb from the ankle down, not the temporary numbness of brief cold exposure that resolves with warming, something deeper. The kind that does not resolve with warming because the warming process itself becomes a form of damage. He knew this theoretically. Everyone at altitude knew the signs of serious frostbite in the way that everyone near a river knew the signs of a current that was too strong to swim. In theory, from a safe distance. He built the forge fire up as high as it would go and sat down close to it and waited for sensation to return to his feet. He waited for an hour, then 2. The sensation that returned was not the right kind. On the 10th day, the storm reached its nadir. 41 degrees below zero at the mercantile thermometer, the reading confirmed by 3 separate witnesses who stood in the killing cold long enough to establish that the mercury thread had indeed contracted to the lowest graduation on the scale and was pressed against the bottom of the tube as though trying to retreat from what it was being asked to measure. The wind had not stopped in 10 days. It had modulated, sometimes a sustained roar, sometimes a lower howl, occasionally dropping to a moan that was almost worse because it suggested intention rather than force, but it had not stopped. It had worn against every structure in Ridgerest with the tireless persistence of a process that had no deadline and no fatigue and no interest in outcomes. It had found every weakness in every wall and developed those weaknesses with the systematic thoroughness of something that had all the time in the world. Inside the Cade mansion, the kitchen hearth was the last functioning heat source. The upper floors had been abandoned on the 4th day, the rooms there having become indistinguishable from the outside in temperature once the window shattered. The kitchen was survivable, not comfortable, not warm in any sense that the word had previously carried for Prescott and Dorothea Cade, but survivable in the specific technical sense that a human body with sufficient clothing and caloric intake could maintain its core temperature above the threshold where organ failure becomes probable. Prescott stood at the kitchen window, a small north-facing pane that had survived because it was sheltered by an overhang, and looked at the white nothing where his cattle had been. He had not spoken much in the past week. This was notable because Prescott Cade had been speaking consistently and loudly since approximately age 14, when he had discovered that a confident voice and a certain quality of forward physical presence could substitute for actual certainty in most social situations. He had operated on this principle for 30 years with considerable success. The storm had dismantled it with the same indifferent efficiency it had applied to everything else he owned. Dorothea came to stand beside him. The baby was asleep in the basket they had rigged near the hearth, the most consistently warm square foot in the building. "She told us," Prescott said. Dorothea had known he was going to say this. She had been waiting for it since the 3rd day when the barn went down. She had been constructing her response to it in the intervals between feeding the baby and managing the servants who had retreated to the kitchen and were now collectively trying to understand what survival looked like for people who had never previously been required to think about it. "Yes," she said. She did. Prescott's jaw moved. She watched the muscles in his face work against something, the specific resistance of a man whose self-image is built on a particular kind of bedrock, encountering the information that the bedrock is not what he thought it was. "The magpies," he said, The spring temperature. Yes, she knew. Dorothea looked at her husband's profile. 18 years. She had seen him angry, satisfied, calculating, generous, in the specific way that powerful men are generous when generosity serves their purposes. She had never seen what she was seeing now, the complete absence of performance. The face of a man who has been stripped of the material he normally uses to construct himself standing in the middle of his kitchen in the wreckage of everything he thought he had built. She knew, Dorothea said, because she spent 2 years learning to know. While we laughed, Prescott said nothing. He sat down on the kitchen floor, which was something she had never seen him do in the entire span of their marriage, and he stayed there for a long time, and Dorothea Cade looked at him and began making a decision that would require more courage than anything she had done in her comfortable and well-appointed life. On the 12th day, she acted on it. The baby's breathing had developed a quality that frightened her. Not distressed, not labored, but thin. Thin in the way that breathing becomes when the body is rationing its resources, when the ambient temperature has been below what young lungs are designed for long enough that the margins are narrowing. The kitchen fire was burning. She was not out of fuel yet, but she was calculating forward to the point where she would be, and the calculation did not produce a comfortable answer. She remembered, and this was the thing that had been living in the back of her mind since the 4th day, growing with the specific persistence of a thought that knows it is important. She remembered a conversation she had dismissed at the time, a fragment from months ago in the social setting of someone's parlor, a comment Hazel Vane had made in passing about connected passages in the properties they reached. Dorothea had not been paying attention. She had been managing 3 other conversations simultaneously the way women of her social position learned to manage social spaces, and the words had entered her hearing without engaging her consideration. They were engaging her consideration now. She bundled the baby and everything available. 3 quilts, her own heavy coat over the wrappings. She did not tell Prescott what she was doing. She did not tell anyone. She opened the back kitchen door and stepped into the white. The cold was a physical event. It struck her face like a thrown object and began its work immediately, finding the exposed skin around her eyes and the gap between her scarf and her collar with professional efficiency. She walked as fast as she could manage through snow that reached her thighs, in places keeping the baby pressed against her chest, with both arms using the warmth of her own body as the last line of defense between her daughter and the arithmetic of 40 below. The hillside was harder to navigate than it looked from the road. The snow had sculpted the terrain into configurations that had nothing to do with its summer geography. She fell twice, catching herself each time with one hand, keeping the baby elevated, with the other pushing herself back upright, through the specific muscular desperation of a woman who has understood that falling a 3rd time may exceed the remaining margin. She found the door by running her hand along the stone face of the hillside in the place where she thought she remembered it being. Her fingers found the frame before her eyes confirmed it, the wood slightly less cold than the stone around it. The gap between door and frame, a hairline that her fingernails could just detect. She found the iron handle. She pulled. The door opened inward. Warmth came out, not to the overwhelming heat of a heated building, but something above ambient, something that the cold shock body registered as remarkable, regardless of its actual temperature. And darkness beyond it, and then from somewhere deep in that darkness, the faint yellow suggestion of lamplight. She knocked 3 times against the doorframe because knocking was the civilized thing to do, and she was still, despite everything, Dorothea Cade. The lamplight grew, footsteps in the stone passage unhurried, a woman's figure emerging from the dark, carrying the light in one hand, and something that might have been a pistol in the other, and then close enough to see clearly Hazel Vane's face, composed and unsurprised, reading the situation with one sweep of assessment and arriving at the only conclusion that mattered. Dorothea opened her mouth to speak. What she had prepared to say, some version of explanation of context of the social lubrication that she had applied to every difficult moment in her adult life, disappeared entirely. What came out instead was 2 words stripped to their absolute core. My daughter. Hazel Vane stepped back and opened the door wider and said the 5 words that Dorothea would repeat for the rest of her life to anyone who asked her what survival sounded like. Bring everyone. Bring them now. Dorothea stood in the entrance of the passage for 3 seconds after Hazel spoke. 3 seconds in which the warmth coming from the tunnel's interior reached her face and her hands, and the exposed skin around her eyes and her body registered the sensation with the specific shock of something that has been denied long enough that its return feels like a different thing entirely from what it was before. Then she thrust the baby into Hazel's arms and turned back into the storm without a word. Hazel looked down at the child, 6 months old perhaps, wrapped in 3 quilts and a woman's heavy coat, the layers of insulation that a mother assembles when she understands that the margin between her child and death has narrowed to the width of fabric and body heat. The baby's breathing was shallow but steady. Her color in the lamplight was not what it should have been. But she was alive, and the warmth of the passage was already doing what warmth does when applied to a body that has been too cold for too long. Hazel carried her to the hearthroom and unwrapped her carefully layer by layer, checking as she went. No visible frostbite. The insulation had done its work. She wrapped the child in the blanket she kept warming near the stove and held her against her own chest and listened to the breathing steady and deepen as the temperature differential between the baby's body and the surrounding air reduced itself to something the young lungs recognized as normal. She sat in her carved wooden chair beside the cast iron stove and waited. They began arriving within the hour. Edmund Pruitt came first, which surprised her. He came through the passage door that connected to the hillside above the root cellar where she had seen the small footprints, and he came carrying Ida, whose feet had taken serious cold damage in the minutes between the house collapsing and the root cellar's shelter being established. Their 2 daughters walked alongside him, one holding his coat, one holding her mother's hand, both of them wearing the hollow-eyed expression of children who have seen something they do not yet have the internal architecture to properly file. Edmund set Ida down on the blankets nearest the stove. He looked around the chamber, the carved sandstone walls, the ventilation pipes, the shelves of provisions, the steady lamplight, the temperature that his skin assessed as 50 degrees warmer than what he had been living in for 5 days. His face moved through several expressions in quick succession, none of them settling. Then he looked at Hazel, and his expression settled into something that was not exactly readable, but contained at its center the specific quality of a man who is doing an accounting that he knows will not resolve in his favor. "Where is Clem?" Hazel said. Edmund's face changed again. Something went out of it. "He stayed," Edmund said. "He listened to me." His voice was flat in the way voices go flat when the speaker is using every available resource to maintain function and has nothing left for inflection. "I told him to stay, and he stayed." Hazel looked at him for a moment. Then she turned to arrange more blankets near the stove and said nothing, because nothing was the correct thing to say, and because Gretel had taught her that comfort offered too quickly was a form of dismissal rather than acknowledgement. And Edmund Pruitt's grief had not yet found its shape and would not benefit from being rushed toward resolution. She gave Ida warm broth from the pot she had been keeping ready. She checked the woman's feet with careful hands and confirmed what she had suspected from the way Edmund had carried her 3 toes on the left foot that had gone beyond the point where warming would restore them. She wrapped them in clean cloth and said nothing about this either. That conversation could wait until there was a doctor present to give it the authority of professional certainty. There was, she would learn, no longer a doctor in Ridgerest. Dr. Harlan Voss had been found frozen in the snow 300 yards from his front door on the 8th day of the storm, his medical bag still clutched in his stiff hands. He had been trying to reach a patient when the storm renewed itself with a force that gave no quarter to intentions, however good. His death left a gap that would not be properly filled for 2 years, and it left Hazel with the specific weight of knowing that a connected passage from his property to hers might have meant something different for the people he had been trying to reach. Prescott Cade arrived 2 hours after his wife, half carrying 2 of his household servants, who had been trapped in the upper floors when the window shattered and had survived by building a shelter of furniture and bedding in the interior hallway. He looked older than he had at the feed store 14 days ago. Not tired older, something more structural. The way a building looks older after a load-bearing element has been removed and the remaining structure has redistributed to compensate. He stopped in the entrance to the hearthroom and looked at what his wife had found: the stove, the provisions, the 30 feet of carved sandstone that had absorbed the worst the high country could generate without a crack or a complaint. And then he looked at Hazel, who was distributing broth in measured portions and organizing the arrangement of people in blankets with the quiet efficiency of someone who had thought through exactly this scenario and was executing the plan she had made for it. He did not speak. She did not speak to him. There was nothing that needed to be said in that moment that the moment was not already saying. She gestured him toward the east wall where space had been cleared. He led his servants there and helped them settle, and then stood with his back against the stone and watched the room fill. Silas Breck came next, dragged on a makeshift sledge by two neighbors who had found him in his forge conscious, but barely both feet wrapped in rags that had soaked through. Hazel looked at the rags and then at Silas's face and then at his feet, and the assessment she made was visible in the slight tightening around her eyes before she controlled it. She directed the two men to lay him nearest the stove and unwrap the rags with hands that did not hesitate, because hesitation in this specific situation was a luxury that Silas Breck's feet could not afford. The damage was what the cold had made it. She wrapped the feet in clean cloth, elevated them on a folded blanket, and gave Silas the strongest broth she had. He drank it without speaking and looked at her with the eyes of a man who had already in the long hours in his forge made his peace with what was coming. "The horses," he said. "Alive," she said, "in the passage to the north. I brought them in 2 days ago." Something moved through Silas Breck's face that was not quite a smile, but occupied the same territory. More came. The Hendricks family from the eastern claim moving in single file through the northeast passage. A widow named Clara Stowe, whose husband had tried to reach the mercantile on the fourth day and had not returned, and whose silence on this fact told Hazel everything she needed to know about what Clara had accepted. A teenage boy named Ward Pickett, whose family had been in the outlying claims, and who arrived alone, walking with eyes that had absorbed things that 17 years had not equipped him to process. By the end of that first day, underground, 23 people filled Hazel's chambers. By the following morning, 31. The hearth room at 31 people ran at 52 degrees, which was the sum of the stove's output, and the body heat of 31 living humans crowded into 300 square feet of carved sandstone. Not comfortable. Not warm in any sense that the word carries associations of ease and relaxation and choice. Warm in the way that matters, which is the way that means the difference between the body systems continuing to function and the body systems beginning the cascade of failures that cold initiates when it has been given enough time and proximity. Hazel organized them with the efficiency of someone working from a plan rather than improvising. Children nearest the stove arranged by age, with the youngest in the innermost position. Injured and frostbitten against the east wall where she could monitor them without crossing the room. Able-bodied adults distributed through the remaining space in a configuration that maximized the heat distribution from the stove and the bodies both. She distributed water in measured portions and broth twice daily, and dried beans that she had been soaking in rotation since the storm began. She rationed the lamp oil to 3 lamps burning at reduced wick, enough light to navigate and work by, but not the generous illumination that would exhaust her supplies before the storm had finished its business. She taught while she worked. This was not something she had planned specifically, but it emerged naturally from the questions that began on the first full day of shared occupation and did not stop. Edmund Pruitt sat against the north wall and watched her manage the ventilation check and asked in a voice stripped of everything except genuine need to understand how the pipes worked. She explained the angle, the diameter, the positioning relative to prevailing wind direction. He listened with the attention of a man who is learning something that he wishes he had learned before he needed it. Prescott Cade listened from across the room without asking questions. She could see him listening, the specific quality of stillness that a person achieves when they are absorbing information rather than waiting for their turn to speak. It was a quality she had not associated with him previously. On the fourth evening, Dorothea Cade came to sit beside her while she was measuring lamp oil into the small clay vessels that would light the passages through the night. "I organized the vote," Dorothea said. Her voice had the particular flatness of a person reciting facts that they have been carrying long enough that the weight of them has changed the texture of how they speak. "To exclude you from the Christmas supper. I said your fixation on living underground was unwholesome. I said, she stopped, started again. "I said you had forgotten how civilized people behaved." Hazel continued measuring oil. The task required a steady hand in a specific quantity, and she did not interrupt either for the conversation. "And then the storm came," Dorothea continued, "and my civilized house lost every window in the first 4 hours. And I walked into that storm with my daughter because I remembered something you had said about connected passages, and I thought, she drew a breath that was not quite steady. I thought perhaps the woman we had mocked would still help us, even after everything. Hazel set down the oil measure and looked at Dorothea directly for the first time in the conversation. "These hands will blister," she said. She reached out and took Dorothea's free hand and turned it palm up. The skin was soft, the hands of a woman whose relationship to labor had been entirely managerial. "They will callous. They will ache in ways your current vocabulary doesn't have words for. Stone does not yield to good intentions or to social standing. It yields only to work repeated until the work becomes part of who you are." Dorothea looked at her own palm. Then she looked up. "I understand." "Understanding is not the same as enduring," Hazel said. She released the hand and picked up the oil measure again. "Many people understand that fire burns. Fewer are willing to work near flames until they learn exactly how close they can stand." She reached under the provisions shelf and produced a small hand chisel and set it on the stone beside Dorothea without further comment. Dorothea picked it up. She held it for a long moment, feeling its weight. Then she asked in a voice that carried something underneath the exhaustion, something with the quality of metal rather than cloth, how to identify the fracture lines in sandstone that showed where the stone wanted to open. Hazel showed her. On the 10th day underground, the spring ran cooler. She measured it at the 6-hour mark, and then again, 3 hours later, to confirm the reading was not anomalous. The temperature had dropped a full degree from its peak. She recorded the number in her notebook and sat with it for a moment, doing the calculation that Gretel had taught her the relationship between groundwater temperature and atmospheric pressure, the rate of change that indicated whether a pressure system was building or exhausting itself. Exhausting. The pressure was rising, slowly but consistently, in the direction that meant the storm had spent the largest portion of what it had brought with it and was moving toward resolution. She estimated 3 more days, perhaps 4. She told no one. The information would change nothing about the practical management of the current situation, and hope introduced prematurely into a confined space with 31 people could become its own kind of problem. The relaxation of vigilance, the reduction of the careful discipline that had kept everyone functional, the specific danger of people beginning to act as though the emergency were already over before it actually was. She kept the information in her notebook and managed the remaining days with the same steady attention she had brought to the first ones. Edmund Pruitt carved horses from scraps of firewood throughout those final days. Small ones precisely rendered despite the tools available, each one taking a day or two of the patient work that his hands performed while his mind was somewhere else entirely. He made 7 of them in the time underground. He never spoke about why. He did not need to. The hearth room understood the 7 horses without explanation. Ward Pickett, the 17-year-old from the outlying claim, attached himself to the practical work of the camp, feeding the stove, checking the passages carrying water from the spring channel to the distribution point, with the focused energy of a young person who has discovered that purposeful activity is the most effective available management for things that cannot yet be processed. Hazel put him to work without comment and paid attention to his face in the evenings, and what she saw there over the course of 10 days was not resolution, but the beginning of the scaffolding that resolution would eventually build itself on. Reverend Corbett Weil moved through the chambers in the evenings, speaking quietly with the people who wanted to be spoken to and sitting in silence with the ones who did not. He led no formal services. He opened his Bible several times and then closed it again, without reading aloud, as though measuring the gap between what the text offered and what the situation required, and finding that gap too wide for the usual bridge. He was home. Hazel observed a man in the process of learning something about the relationship between the comfort he had been trained to provide and the comfort that the people around him actually needed. On the 17th day, the wind stopped. It stopped between 2 and 3 in the morning, in the way that sustained storms sometimes end, not with a gradual diminishment, but with a sudden absence, as though something had made a decision. The vibration that Hazel had been feeling through the stone for 17 days ceased so completely that it woke her from a light sleep she had not known she was having. She sat up in the silence and listened to 30 people breathing in the dark. Then she got up and checked the spring temperature and recorded it in her notebook and climbed the access ladder to test the ventilation and confirm that the air quality in the passage was what it should be when conditions outside had genuinely moderated. Everything read correctly. She descended and fed the stove and sat in her chair and waited for the light. By mid-morning on March 19th, she was ready to send the first expedition to the surface. She went herself with Prescott Cade and Edmund Pruitt through the main entrance and out into a world that had been rearranged by 17 days of force into configurations that had no relationship to the landscape they had left. Snow lay in drifts 15 feet high along the north faces of every remaining structure. The temperature had risen to 12 degrees below zero, which the body registered as almost warm by the comparative standard it had been living inside. The sun emerging through dispersing cloud cover was aggressively bright against the white surface, and all three of them shielded their eyes in the first minutes as though the light itself required adjustment. The valley below told the story in structural terms. The mercantile's roof had collapsed. She could see the fallen timbers through the broken walls, and beneath them the suggestion of goods that might have survived the collapse itself, even if not the cold. The church steeple had separated from the building and now lay half buried 100 yards from its foundation, the bell visible as a dark shape beneath the ice crust. Of Prescott Cade's cattle barn, nothing remained except several posts frozen upright in the snow, standing in the white field, with a particular quality of markers that have outlasted what they were originally placed to indicate. Prescott stood looking at the posts for a long time. Then he turned to face Hazel, and the expression on his face was not something she had a ready category for. The anger had gone from it, the defensive performance that she had watched sustain itself through every social interaction she had witnessed him conduct. What remained was something more fundamental and considerably less comfortable. The face of a man standing in the accurate accounting of his own choices. "I called this place the Mole Hole," he said. His voice had the roughness of a man who has been speaking very little for days and has gone deeper inside himself than he normally travels. "I said you burrowed like a creature without a soul." Hazel stood with her coat pulled tight against the wind that still carried cold enough to bite diminished but not gone a reminder rather than a threat. She said nothing. "I watched my cattle freeze," Prescott continued. "I watched my windows shatter. I watched my wife walk into a blizzard with our daughter because she had more courage than I did, because she saw something I refused to see." He stopped. His jaw worked. "You saved us. You saved us even though we mocked you, even though we did everything we could to deserve whatever that storm intended for us." The snow creaked beneath their feet in the cold. Edmund stood to one side looking at the ruins of the valley, giving the conversation its space. "I am not asking for forgiveness," Prescott said. "I know I have no standing to ask for it. I am only—" He stopped again, and this time the stopping was longer, the silence of a man searching for language adequate to a weight he had never previously been required to carry. "I am only saying that I was wrong. About everything I said, everything I organized, every time I laughed, and every time I made others laugh with me. I was wrong, and I would like if you are willing to learn to build as you have built." Hazel looked at him for a long moment. The sun was moving behind a thin cloud and the light softened, and in that softer light, Prescott Cade looked like what he was, a man in his 50s who had lost something that could not be rebuilt with money or social position, and was beginning to understand at the level below argument what could replace it. "The mountain does not forgive," she said finally. "It simply remains, and you learn or you do not. I cannot give you absolution for words that wounded me. That belongs to whatever you believe listens to prayers." She shifted her weight in the snow. "But I can teach you to build. If you are willing to learn, I am willing to teach. That is what I have to offer." Prescott met her eyes. Whatever he found there settled something in him. Not comfort, not relief, but the specific quality of acceptance that comes when a person stops fighting the shape of the accounting and begins working within its actual terms. "I am willing," he said. The reckoning came in April, when the snow had receded enough to expose the stone, and the surviving structures of Ridgerest had been made habitable enough to suggest that ordinary life might eventually resume. They gathered in the hearth room on the 1484 of the 91 souls who had inhabited the valley before the storm. The 9 who did not come were the 9 who could not. Hazel had arranged the salvaged church benches in a rough circle around the stove. The lamplight showed the chisel marks on the sandstone walls, each stroke a record of the 2 years of work that had existed while the community above it organized its mockery and conducted its social exclusions and made its comfortable assumptions about the limits of what the Colorado high country could produce. Prescott Cade spoke first. He stood in the center of the circle and said everything. The mole hole, the laughter at the mercantile, the ladies' aid vote, the contempt performed for audiences, the mockery offered as entertainment and received as currency. He said it without qualification or self-extenuation, in the flat, factual cadence of a man reading a ledger aloud. When he reached the part about Dorothea walking into the blizzard with their daughter, his voice failed him briefly, and he stood in the silence of it for a moment before continuing. He told them about his brother, the medicine man in Ohio. The reason that people who operated outside understood systems had always activated something in him that he had never examined closely enough to identify as fear. He had not planned to say this. It came out with the specific, involuntary quality of a thing that has been contained long enough that the container finally fails. The room listened in complete silence. Dorothea spoke next. Then Edmund Pruitt, who did not offer much language but stood up and said his son's name, Clem, and sat back down, and the two words he had not said in between his son's name and his own sitting down and were understood by everyone in the room without needing to be spoken. Silas Breck spoke from his chair, his wrapped stumps extended on the blanket Hazel had put beneath them. He said he did not regret saving the horses. He said the same thing he would say for the next 23 years when people expressed sympathy about his feet. Better no feet than no life. Reverend Weil spoke last among the confessors. He talked about comfort, about the specific moral failure of a man who privately disagrees with the crowd and publicly says nothing, who suggests fellowship in private conversations and does not challenge exclusion in public ones. He did not call this by the theological term he had used in 23 years of sermons. He called it cowardice, which was the accurate word. The room looked at Hazel. She let the silence exist for long enough that it became its own statement. Then she stepped into the center of the circle. I cannot give you the forgiveness you are asking for, she said. Not because I am withholding it, but because it is not mine to grant. The harm the storm caused was not harm done to me. I was prepared. My preparation protected me. The harm was done to you, to your cattle, your homes, your children, your certainty that the world would always accommodate your comfort. She paused. I cannot forgive harm done to you by your own choices. She looked at Edmund. Your son knew he was loved. That knowledge went with him. What remains is for you to build a world where the next storm cannot take what you refuse to surrender. She looked at Prescott. The mountain does not forgive. It simply remains, and you learn or you do not. She looked around the circle at every face that had laughed, every face that had been silent, every face that had organized and voted and whispered and looked away. The dead do not return for our regrets. They ask only that we carry forward what we learned from their dying. Clem Pruitt died for something, or he died for nothing. Widow Opal Tench died for something, or she died for nothing. The doctor frozen in the snow with his bag in his hand died for something, or he died for nothing. What determines which it was is not anything you say in this room today. It is what you build after you leave it. She reached out and took Prescott's hand, and then Dorothea's, and drew them gently forward. What I can offer is knowledge. My grandmother taught my mother, and my mother taught me, and now I will teach anyone who is willing to learn. How to read stone, how to carve passages, how to store water and food and heat against the season when the sky decides to demonstrate what it is capable of. How to listen to the earth when it speaks of what is coming. She released their hands. That is what I have. Not forgiveness, not absolution. Knowledge and the willingness to transmit it to hands that will do the work. The silence that followed was different from the silence before it. Something had shifted in the room in the way that pressure shifts, not with a dramatic event, but with a change in the fundamental conditions, a settling into a new and more accurate configuration. Edmund Pruitt spoke into the silence, not to Hazel, to the room. I wish to learn, he said. One by one, the others said the same. During those days, when the community was learning to emerge from its frozen nightmare, Dorothea took Hazel through the passage toward the Cade property one afternoon to check the branch connection. They walked the 87 feet in silence. Hazel holding the lamp until Dorothea stopped and placed both hands flat against the tunnel walls. She had realized it on her third day underground, lying awake while the baby slept. The tunnel ran beneath the Cade property, beneath the floors of the house she had lived in for 18 years, beneath the parlor where she had organized the vote to exclude the woman now standing beside her, holding the lamp that lit both their faces. "You built this before you knew us," Dorothea said. Not a question. "Yes. You built doors that opened from both sides, before you knew if anyone would ever use them." "Yes." Dorothea stood in the tunnel beneath her own home and said nothing for a long time. "Then that is either the most trusting thing I have ever witnessed or the most prepared." "They are the same thing," Hazel said, "at altitude. 40 years pass the way years pass when they are filled with work that matters." The Ridgerest method spread through the Colorado high country with the specific momentum of a practical idea that proves itself through results rather than argument. By 1891, the next severe winter found the valley prepared. By 1900, 30 families across the mountain corridor had adopted some version of the underground connection system. By 1920, the number had grown to include communities that Hazel had never visited, learning from people who had learned from people who had learned from her. Prescott Cade became her most dedicated student. He spent 3 years working alongside her, his hands developing calluses in the work of honest labor, his understanding of sandstone fracture lines growing from ignorance to competence, to something approaching the intuition that came from true familiarity. He sold half his remaining acreage in 1888 and used the proceeds to fund a network of underground connections across the valley. When the storm of 1891 passed without a single fatality in Ridgerest, he stood in the hearthroom that he had built with his own hands and wept with the specific quality of release that belongs to a man who has converted something toxic into something useful and can feel the difference. In the winter of 1891, with the second great storm moving through Ridgerest, in the community sheltered and provisioned beneath the earth, Prescott sought Hazel out in the central chamber. He did not come with words prepared. He came and stood beside her and placed his hand against the sandstone wall, the same gesture she had made 1,000 times reading the stone's report on what the sky was doing above. He held his hand there for a long moment. Then he looked at her. She looked at him. He nodded once. She nodded back. No words. None were needed. The accounting had been made, the work had been done, and the wall between their hands was the evidence. Dorothea Cade's hands blistered as Hazel had promised. They calloused. She learned to read fracture lines and follow water seams and set ventilation angles with the precision of a woman who had decided that competence was the only adequate response to the debt she was carrying. She named her second daughter Gretle after a Swiss woman who had survived 2 avalanches and taught her granddaughter that the stone remains when everything else is gone. The name traveled forward in the Cade family for 3 generations. Edmund Pruitt built the best underground system in Ridgerest after Hazel's own, and he built it without being asked. He started the spring after the storm and worked through 3 seasons, his daughters helping once they were old enough to manage the tools. The carved wooden bear that Clem had died for that sat on the shelf in the rebuilt Pruitt house for 40 years. Nobody moved it. Nobody needed to explain why. Silas Breck lived another 23 years without feet working leather and harnesses from a wheeled chair that Hazel designed from salvaged wagon parts in the summer of 1887. He never complained. He told visitors who expressed sympathy that Hazel Vane had given him his life, and he could spare 2 feet for that. Reverend Weil preached differently after the storm. Something in the gap between what he said privately and what he said publicly had narrowed until it was no longer perceptible. He lived another 20 years in Ridgerest and spent a portion of every spring helping whatever family needed their first underground chamber started swinging a pickaxe with the particular determination of a man working off a debt he knew he could not fully discharge, but intended to reduce by as much as honest labor would allow. Cinder died in the spring of 1894 at 19 years old. Hazel buried her on the hillside above the central chamber and carved the stone marker herself over the course of a week, working with the hand chisel that she had used to carve everything else on that hillside. The inscription read simply, "She knew what mattered." Hazel Vane died on the 17th of March, 1923, at the age of 71. She died in the hearthroom she had carved 40 years earlier, in the chair she had made from salvaged wagon wood in her first winter. Underground, surrounded by her 3 adopted children and the 11 people who called her teacher and the grandchildren of survivors who owed their existence to passages cut through solid stone by a woman who had learned from a woman who had learned from the mountain itself. Her final words, as recorded by 4 witnesses, were 3. Tell them. Stone remains. The funeral procession stretched a quarter-mile through a March afternoon that carried no malice, only the thin, clean sunlight of early spring and the distant calling of magpies returned to their roosts in the cottonwoods along Ridgerest Creek. The birds had come back the same week every year for 40 springs, and each year Hazel had noted their return in the small notebook she kept beside the spring channel. One line of observation among thousands accumulated over decades of listening to what the earth was willing to say to those patient enough to learn its language. They buried her beside cinder on the hillside above the central chamber. Prescott Cade carved the stone marker himself. He was 83 years old and moving slowly, and his children offered to take over the work, and he declined each offer with the quiet finality of a man who understands that certain debts require the personal application of the debtor's own hands. He worked for 2 weeks. Each letter was cut with the care that comes not from skill alone, but from the understanding that the work is a form of statement, that the chisel in the hand is saying something that the voice cannot adequately manage. The marker read, "Every passage is a promise kept." Above the central chamber entrance, a larger inscription was added to the living stone, carved by a group of students who had learned their tools from Hazel and their purpose from the storm. Reverend Weil, 91 years old and leaning on a cane with both hands, read the words aloud when the final letter was completed, his voice carrying across the assembled community in the thin spring air. Every passage is a promise kept. The children who had never known the storm asked their parents what it meant. And the parents told them about the winter that ate the spring, about the woman who had spent 2 years carving shelter, while the community above her organized its contempt, about the 17 days that had revealed the precise weight of the difference between preparation and assumption. They told it the way the important stories get told, not as history exactly, but as instruction, as the kind of knowledge that needs to travel from one generation of hands to the next, because the sky does not consult almanacs, and the stone does not offer its protection to those who have not earned it. The tunnels still stand. A century and more after Hazel Vane first broke ground with her pickaxe on a rocky Colorado hillside that the land office clerk had called worthless, the passages remain navigable. The sandstone walls hold at 18 inches. The ventilation pipes draw clean air at the angles Gretle Muller calculated and transmitted through one granddaughter's hands to the mountain above Ridgerest. The underground spring still flows, still registers the pressure changes that the sky makes before it shows them on any surface instrument, still carries the information to those who know how to read it. Visitors come now. They walk through chambers that once held 31 desperate souls pressed together for warmth, and they read the plaques that tell what happened during 17 days in March of 1887. They place their hands against the sandstone walls the way Hazel placed her hand against it on that first afternoon, and some of them, the ones who are paying attention, can feel what she felt. Not the vibration of an approaching storm, not today, but something older than that. The record of 2 years of solitary work undertaken in the face of ridicule for the benefit of people who had not yet earned it and would not understand it until they needed it. Above the entrance in stone that has absorbed 140 winters without complaint, the inscription remains. Every passage is a promise kept. Gretle Muller would have recognized those words. She had taught her granddaughter that the earth protects those who go into it, that the sky betrays but the stone remains, that knowledge passed from hand to hand across generations is the only architecture that outlasts the storms that come for everything else. The promise is not about forgiveness. It is not about the complicated mathematics of guilt and reckoning and the partial settlements that are all that living people can manage between themselves and the dead. The promise is simpler than that and more demanding. It is the promise that preparation makes to the future, that knowledge makes to those who have not yet been born to need it, that every hand that picks up a chisel and learns to read the fracture lines in stone is making to every hand that will pick up a chisel after it. On the hillside above Ridgerest, where the magpies still return each spring to the cottonwoods along the creek, where the horses still graze in the long grass of summer and still cluster at fence posts in the hours before a storm arrives. Hazel Vane rests beside a strawberry roan mare whose coat glowed in certain lights, like something that had been through fire and survived it. Her work is not done. It is simply being done by other hands now, and the stone that holds it has not moved.